Hi there, it's time for the Commodore 64 compilation review, and today I'm going to be looking at a budget compilation. It's For Most Megaheroes. This was released by Alternative Software in 1991, and as you'd expect, it features 4 games. 3 of those games are re-releases of full price games, and this compilation cost £3.99 when it was originally released. So 4 games for £4. It's got to be a bargain, right? Well, let's take a look at the games and find out. Let's take a closer look at the packaging for For Most Megaheroes then. Quite obviously the theme of this compilation is heroes, so there's lots of heroic characters on the front. And the 4 games are Dandy, Freddie Hardest, Humdinger and Space Trooper, although Space Trooper is not the original name for that game. We'll get back to that in a moment. So the artwork is a mixture of the cover artwork for the various games, kind of split into 4, and then it's got an Alternative Software logo. It's got the 4-in-1 thing in the middle there as well. And yeah, these cover artwork snippets not that easy to see, and I don't think any of them are the original cover artwork for the games that have been re-released. These were full price games, Dandy and Freddie Hardest, and I'm pretty sure that it's not the original covers for those. I think Alternative did re-release these individually as budget price re-releases, so it may be the artwork for those releases. Humdinger is an original game from Alternative that was released at budget price and then re-released. And Space Trooper, well, that's not its original name, as I mentioned. It was originally Rogue Trooper, which is based on one of the characters from the 2000 AD comic. So I'm not sure why it was renamed Space Trooper for this compilation, maybe just to save some money from licensing and things like that, but that bit of artwork in particular is quite poor. So let's move and have a look at the spine. It's pretty straightforward. It just says For Most Megaheroes on it. Not that easy to read, so if you were looking at these compilations in a shop and it was sort of spine on like that, I'm not sure it would attract much attention. The front cover is reasonably attractive. It's colourful without being particularly outstanding in any way. And on the back we've got screenshots of the 4 games in a completely different order to what they are on the front. And yeah, not very good screenshots either. I mean, I can't see anything of note on that Humdinger one. Freddie Hardest you can see fairly straightforward. Space Trooper, as I mentioned, formerly Rogue Trooper, it looks pretty spectrumy on there. And also Dandy is kind of mostly obscured by the barcode and the punch out for the spool holding thing on the tape case, whatever you call that, so that's not very well done. It says screen pictures maybe from a different machine version of the game, and at least a couple of those I think are. Other than that, it just says Mega Heroes on it again. No description of any of the games on the back. So here's the cassette for the compilation. It's the standard Alternative Software label. It says For Most Megaheroes on it, and it's got what games are on which side of the tape in very small font on the bottom left there. And as you can see, it mentions Dandy, Freddie Hardest, Rogue Trooper and Humdinger. Humdinger's spelt wrong and Rogue Trooper's referred to by its original name there. And it's also got the loading instructions for all 3 systems that this compilation was released for, even though this is quite obviously the Commodore 64 version. So let's now move on to look at the instructions for the compilation. There's a bit of colour on this part because obviously the front was printed in colour, the back of it's all in black and white. So you've got the instructions for each game, fairly comprehensive. I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but you've got Dandy first, you've then got Space Trooper, and what's notable about these instructions is they quite clearly just got the original instructions and replaced the word Rogue with Space. That's most noticeable here, where it says tread carefully Space. The planet is swarming with aliens. Well, that would have made a lot more sense when it said tread carefully Rogue. It then moves on to do the instructions for Freddie Hardest, which wrap round onto the back. Very comprehensive for these ones. You've got all the controls and things. When I zoom it in right, there you go, you've got all the controls. This game's in 2 parts. You then got an overview of all the different aliens, which it sort of kept on the budget packaging, which is quite surprising. I don't think that was really necessary. You could have just said there's some aliens you need to get rid of. So yeah, it then goes on to tell you about part 2. It's got the screen layout and all kinds of good stuff there for Freddie Hardest. And then finally you've got the instructions for Humdinger, which is just a very small section at the very end of the instructions. So that was the packaging for the game. Let's now start taking a look at the 4 games included on this compilation. Let's start off by looking at an advert related to this compilation. It doesn't actually feature this specific compilation on it, but a reference to it. This is an advert from Alternative Software in issue 81 of Zap from February 1992, and as you can see, lots of different stuff included from the budget publisher on this advert. But down at the bottom there's a picture of For Most Speed Stunts, which is one of the other compilations in this range, and also For Most Megaheroes is listed there. 4 great games for only £3.99, and this basically just proves that it did cost £3.99 and it was released in 1991. So let's move on to looking at the 4 games in the compilation. I should begin by saying that I've never played any of these games before I did this review. First up we have Dandy, which was originally released by Electric Dreams in 1986. It's a top-down dungeon crawler for 1 or 2 players. You play either Sheba or Thor, and you attack and slash your way through 15 dungeons, grabbing the treasure and destroying all the enemies that you come across. Along the way you'll also find food to keep your energy topped up and spells to allow you to cast magic. Magic spells are cast randomly and either disorient, paralyse or kill all the enemies on screen, and you can also trade treasure for energy to keep it topped up if you can't find any food. So one look at this game and you probably think it's a Gauntlet clone, especially as it's released after Gauntlet was released in the arcades, but actually the original version of Dandy was released on the Atari 8-bit systems in 1983, so it actually predates Gauntlet and is considered an inspiration for Atari's arcade game. The first thing you'll notice about this game is the graphics, which are absolutely horrendous. Although it's not purely monochrome, it does have a real spectrumy look to it with the bright coloured backgrounds and black sprites. That colour combination makes it really hard to distinguish between enemies and items, and the game's also got really crap sound effects and no music. One of the big problems with it is it's flick screen rather than smooth scrolling, and what happens a lot is you can accidentally flick the screen and all the enemies will respawn when you've just cleared them away. Enemy generators can be destroyed, but only when all the enemies on screen have gone, so that can be quite challenging. The fact that you can buy health with treasure is a nice touch, but aside from that there's not much to be positive about for this game. One of the big problems is that treasure, food and keys can all be shot, which potentially means you can get stuck in a level with no way to escape if you shoot a key accidentally. If you're a fan of these top-down Gauntlet style games then you may get a bit of fun out of it. The game is playable and might be reasonably fun for 2 simultaneous players, but I found it fairly boring and it's very ugly to look at. It may have originally inspired Gauntlet, but this game's a poor substitute for the Commodore 64 version of the arcade game. Next up on this compilation is Freddy Hardest, originally released by Imagine in 1987 and programmed by the Spanish software house Dynamic. Freddy Hardest has crash landed on the moon of the planet Turnat, site of the alien base of Kaldor. He scrambles out of his wrecked craft, but it dawns on him that his predicamen's pretty serious. He needs to survive long enough to source some alternative transport and hijack it to make good his escape. The game's split into 2 parts, each of which loads separately from the tape. In part 1, Freddy's objective is to reach the enemy base situated at the far end of the moon. To achieve this hazardous task he must avoid or dispose of a number of aliens and also negotiate moving platforms. Once inside the alien base you must find one of 4 colour-coded spaceships, and to escape to freedom you must obtain the captain's code, load the ship's energy and locate instructions to initiate the jump to hyperspace. Whilst completing your tasks you also have to cope with some pretty angry residents who don't want you to break into their base and steal the spaceship. First impressions of this game are pretty good. It's got a nice animated title screen with some decent music, and the in-game graphics are good as well, with big colourful cartoony sprites and reasonable backgrounds. The sound effects are also pretty decent too. The big problem with this game is it really lives up to the name. It's one of the hardest games I've ever played on the Commodore 64. The gameplay is insanely hard and also unfair. On the first stage you need pixel perfect jumps to negotiate the moving platforms, and the other problem is enemies often spawn right in front of you just in the area you're about to land in, meaning you can't avoid them and immediately lose a life. It doesn't really help that the controls are quite awkward. For some reason they decided that you have to push down and press fire to shoot, which is just completely unnecessary. Just pressing the fire button would have been fine. You can also push up and fire to kick, but timing kicks to hit enemies on the first stage is near enough impossible. I got virtually nowhere in this game with just the 5 lives you're given at the start, so I soon fired it up with infinite lives to try and get a bit more footage. The first part is absolutely rock hard and it's also repetitive and quite boring. Once you get to the end of the first level and get a code for the second part, that's actually potentially more enjoyable, with some nice ideas like the terminals you have to access and the dark corridors you need to traverse to move from one area to another. But despite all that, it's still rock hard and you will need cheats to get anywhere in the game. If the difficulty wasn't bad enough, it also seems to be quite glitchy. There's some bad collision detection in places, sometimes the sound screws up, enemies don't die when you shoot them or you land on platforms and fall straight through them. It's a shame really, because if they'd spent as much time playtesting as they had on the nice graphics, it would have been a pretty decent game. Unfortunately, it's way too hard to be any fun despite having the potential to be much better. Up next we have Humdinger, which is the only game on this compilation to originally have been released by Alternative. That was in 1988. You play the hero, Captain Luke Humdinger. After finding things on Earth a little bit rough, you decide to go on a no-frills-included planetary holiday. When you get there, your dreams are instantly shattered as the locals find it amusing to see foreigners in trouble, so they send mechanical drones to attack you. To proceed to the next area, you must collect the required number of bombs and then destroy the final wave of drones. Power-ups are dropped, including extra lives, fuel and bonuses. This was programmed by Sean Southern for Mr. Chip Software, which is usually a sign that it's going to be pretty decent, and sure enough, this is probably the best of the 4 games on the compilation. It's a fairly straightforward budget blaster, horizontally scrolling and probably inspired a little bit by Drop Zone, at least as far as the player sprite is concerned. The scrolling and movements of the player are both smooth, and the background graphics and enemy sprites are nicely designed, though the main sprite is a little bit dull, being only one colour. It's also got some pretty functional sound effects. There's nothing you haven't heard before in other shooters, but they do the job. In terms of gameplay, it's pretty simplistic, but there are a couple of nice touches. I like the fact that if you don't collect a bomb when it drops, it expends some of your energy, and you can also shoot enemies that have gone off screen, which is unusual. The controls are a bit twitchy though. They make collecting the power-ups quite difficult at times, and the bonus stage at the end of each level is particularly tricky, as you have to collect 6 numeric icons in order, and it's quite hard to home in on them in the time limit. Overall, the game's clearly well programmed, but far from Sean Southern's best. It's fun for a quick blast, but it does have limited replayability, with all levels basically being the same, albeit with increasingly complicated formations. Finally, for this compilation we have Space Trooper, or Rogue Trooper as it's known as in game. This was originally released by Piranha Software in 1987 based on the 2000 AD comic strip. You play the sole survivor of the Yablon massacre when the entire regiment of genetic soldiers was betrayed and destroyed. Your only companions are 3 of your buddies, their personalities stored at the moment of their deaths as biochips, now mounted on your gun, backpack and helmet. Your mission is to find and expose the traitor responsible for the slaughter of your comrades. You must search the alien planet for 8 videotapes filmed by security cameras. These tapes provide the only concrete evidence of the traitor's identity. On the top right of the screen, your chip buddies will advise you, support you along the way, aid your protection and make your firing more fierce. They'll dispense the battle computer, ammo, grenades and all kinds of equipment as and when you need it. This game's a flick screen run and gun with collect 'em up elements. You can freely roam around a large map which takes a quasi-isometric perspective. You move left and right normally, but when you move up and down you move diagonally. The graphics are well drawn, but there's a distinct lack of colour, which makes me think this is probably a port from a Spectrum version. It's also got pretty basic sound effects. Now you probably know my feelings on games with an isometric perspective, and to be honest this one's done no favours by it. The perspective makes it very hard to line up shots at enemies above and below you, and objects and enemies are very often hidden behind scenery, which wouldn't necessarily be the case if it wasn't isometric. The game also becomes very sluggish when several enemies are on screen moving around. I do like the idea of the chips of your former comrades giving tips and updates, and the automatic use of medikits when you need them is good too. Unfortunately, it's very easy for your trooper to get shot, and he moves too slowly to avoid a lot of the bullets. For this reason, if you don't find the medipacks frequently, then you'll find yourself dying very quickly, and you only get 1 life. I'd say this one's a pretty decent idea for the game, but unfortunately the execution is very average and frustrating as a result. Let's sum this compilation up then. I couldn't find any magazine reviews for this one, so let's move straight on to my ratings. As I said earlier, I'd not played any of these games before reviewing this compilation, and unfortunately the overall quality was pretty poor. So my ratings for the games out of 10, well, firstly Dandy. If you look at it in the context of when this compilation was released, it just looks like a very poor Gauntlet clone with ugly graphics and boring gameplay, so I'm going to give it 4 out of 10. Freddie Hardest is the most ambitious of the games on this compilation and also the best in terms of graphics and sound, but unfortunately the difficulty level completely ruins it, so I'm just going to give that 3 out of 10. Humdinger is ironically the only game on this compilation that was originally released at budget price, and it is the best of the bunch. There's nothing special about it, it's a pretty straightforward shooter, but it's nicely programmed and offers some reasonable entertainment. I'm giving that 7 out of 10. And finally, Space Trooper is an interesting idea which is unfortunately let down by the unnecessary isometric perspective and a lack of colour in the graphics department. I'm giving that 5 out of 10. So let's move on to the overall ratings for this compilation. And firstly, the packaging, I don't think it's anything special. It's a typical budget packaging. The front cover looks okay, but it's a bit of a mishmash of art styles. And the back cover's got no information about the games other than some fairly hard to see screenshots. The instructions are pretty comprehensive though, so I'm going to give it a packaging score of 6 out of 10. The average rating for the 4 games is 4.75, and in terms of value for money, well, it is 4 games for £4, so you could say it's good value. And although none of the games are exactly outstanding, there is a little bit of playability to be had from most of them, so I'm going to give it a value for money score of 6. The games aren't particularly great, but you could get some play out of them for a few hours, so for £1 each it's not too bad. So that gives this compilation an overall rating of 53%. So let's now look where that puts Most Megaheroes on the leaderboard, and as you can see, it's gone in second from bottom at 5th place. I think that's fair. It's not a great compilation by any means, and there's definitely better budget compilations out there, including a couple of the ones that you can see on this leaderboard. So that rounds off my review of Most Megaheroes. Not a particularly good compilation in the end. I was hoping a couple of those games would have been better, and I have to say if I'd picked this up when I was a kid I probably would have been disappointed. How about you? Do you agree with my ratings for these 4 games, or did I over or underrate some of them in your opinion? If you've got any thoughts about this compilation and the games contained within it, then please let me know in the video comments. I'll be back with another Commodore 64 compilation comparison video in the near future, with plenty of other retro gaming content in the meantime, so until then, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.